Today, we're diving into an enormous journey. We're talking 4 centuries of African American history. Now, it's a story of incredible pain, for sure, but also of profound resilience. And it's so central to the American story that really you can't understand one without the other. So let's trace the key moments of this incredible and quintessentially American journey.
So that's really the question at the heart of all of this, isn't it? How did a history that started with people being brought here in chains end up shaping the very soul of a nation? I mean, from a forced beginning to the highest office in the land, this isn't just one group's history. It's the story of the ideals and the contradictions that define the United States itself.
388,000. Now, you might hear about the 10 million Africans captured in the transatlantic slave trade, but this is the estimate of how many were brought directly here to what would become the United States. And think about that. From those 388,000 people came millions of descendants, a whole new culture, and the very foundations of a national struggle that we're still grappling with today.
So where does this all start? Well, the first chapter begins with a brutal economic and social system, one that would be written into law and last for nearly 250 years. And we have to be clear, this was not some kind of temporary indentured servitude. No, it was something far, far more permanent and far more cruel. You know, looking at this data reveals something absolutely crucial. The people brought to America weren't some single uniform group, not at all. They were Igbo, Bakongo, Mandinka, Wolof, I mean, the list goes on. They came from all across the continent, each with their own distinct languages, religions, and cultures. And they were all forcibly stripped of those identities to be remade into just one category: slave. The system was called chattel slavery for a very specific reason. Chattel is just another word for property, like a table or a farm animal. It was a legal framework designed to literally dehumanize people, turning them into assets that could be bought, sold, and passed down. And a really key moment was in 1662, when a Virginia law made this status permanent and hereditary through the mother. That ensured the system could tragically sustain itself for generations. It's one thing to talk about systems, but it's another to hear from someone who actually lived it. This is a quote from Olaudah Equiano, who was just a child when he was forced to endure the Middle Passage. And his words, they just give voice to an unimaginable horror. The journey across the Atlantic was a nightmare of disease, starvation, and violence. It was the traumatic furnace where the African American experience was first forged. Okay, so after the Civil War, everything changes. Slavery is finally abolished. And for this brief, brilliant, incredible moment, a new era of actual freedom and equality seemed possible. It was a time of radical, almost unbelievable hope. And I mean, just look at the pace of this change. At least on paper, it was stunning. In just 7 years, the Constitution was basically rewritten. You have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments passing, boom, 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 promising freedom, citizenship, and the right to vote for Black men. It was nothing short of a revolution. And this wasn't just talk, it wasn't just words on a page. It was really happening. During this period, known as Reconstruction, Black men voted in huge numbers. They were elected to local offices, state legislatures, and even to the U.S. Senate. All across the South, communities were building their own schools and churches, the fundamental institutions for a new life of freedom. But, and this is a huge but, all of this progress was incredibly fragile. In 1877, as part of a messy political deal, the federal government pulled its troops out of the South, and those were the very soldiers who had been protecting these new rights. So without that protection, well, all the promises of Reconstruction were suddenly left vulnerable to a really violent backlash.
And what came next, what followed, was nearly a century of systematic oppression that we now call the Jim Crow era. This was an entire system designed specifically to undo all the progress of Reconstruction and to put a racial hierarchy right back in place.
So you have this huge gap, right, between the promise and the reality. The promise of citizenship was replaced by the cruel lie of separate but equal. The right to vote was stolen through things like poll taxes and impossible-to-pass literacy tests. And for so many, real economic freedom was replaced by the endless debt cycle of sharecropping, a system that felt an awful lot like the bondage they had just escaped. And how was this whole system enforced? Well, it was enforced by terror. Between the 1890s and the 1940s alone, there were about 5,000 documented lynchings.
And these were not random acts of violence. No, they were a very public tool of intimidation designed to enforce segregation and crush any challenge to white supremacy.
You know, historians have a name for this period. They call it the nadir. And nadir literally means the lowest point. It was an era of just intense, open racism and violence where all those hard-won gains from the previous decades were brutally, systematically erased. But here's the thing about oppression. It always sparks resistance. Faced with the absolute terror of the Jim Crow South, millions of African Americans made a choice. They began another journey, this time a voluntary one, that would change the face of this nation forever. Over 6 million people, essentially, voted with their feet. They left the rural South for industrial cities in the North and the West. They were looking for jobs, sure, but also just for an escape from the violence and the constant stripping of their rights. I mean, this was one of the largest internal migrations in American history. Just massive. And this huge demographic shift, it was completely transformative. For the first time in northern cities like New York's Harlem or Chicago's South Side, you had these large, concentrated, vibrant Black communities. And this concentration of people, of talent, of ideas, it created this incredibly fertile ground for new kinds of cultural and political expression. And out of that fertile ground came a cultural big bang, the Harlem Renaissance. It was just this explosion of art, literature, music, and thought that asserted a new Black identity, one that was proud, modern, and completely unapologetic. I mean, figures like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, they didn't just create amazing art. They were redefining what it meant to be Black in America. So all that cultural power that was forged during the Harlem Renaissance, well, it helped fuel the organized political struggle that was coming. And that brings us to the final chapter of our explainer, the fight to reclaim those original promises of Reconstruction. After decades of unbelievably courageous activism, the legal pillars of Jim Crow finally started to crumble. Brown versus Board of Education struck down segregation in schools, the Civil Rights Act outlawed segregation in public life, and the Voting Rights Act, it finally restored meaningful access to the ballot box. These were absolutely monumental victories. And that brings us to the kind of dual reality of today. On the one hand, you can't deny the progress. The legal framework of Jim Crow is gone. African Americans have reached the absolute highest levels of politics, business, and culture. But on the other hand, the legacy of all those centuries of oppression, it's still with us. You can see it in wealth gaps, in health disparities, and in the criminal justice system. So, it's pretty clear this 400-year journey, well, it's not over. It's an ongoing story of struggle and of progress. That central question, how a nation grapples with a history that began in chains, remains just as urgent as ever. And it leaves all of us to wonder, what will the next chapter of this quintessentially American journey hold?